Question. After watching your video on how the world was created, I cannot seem to overcome my strong desire to expose the original unwise decision the Ascended Masters who created this current fifth sphere made, when they decided to allow those beings from the fourth sphere who had not developed properly to tumble or otherwise embody into this fifth sphere. Was the fifth sphere flawed from the beginning? Instead of allowing the underdeveloped conscious use of those immature beings that could not or blatantly would not progress into the ascended fourth sphere to be cancelled out or otherwise dissolved completely, the Ascended Masters in charge of this allowed the newly created fifth sphere to be contaminated with a fallen consciousness. This effect has allowed an original flaw or wrench in the works of the natural flow or outplaying of the Master's universe ever since. Is this fair? And the question kind of goes on in the same vein. But first of all, I need to make a correction here. If you watch my video on how the world was created, the current sphere is not the fifth sphere, it's actually the seventh. But it's correct, as the question says, that the fall into a lower state of consciousness, the fact that there were some beings that rebelled against the process of growth, that happened in the fourth sphere, and these beings originally fell into the fifth. Then there were beings that fell in the fifth sphere, fell into the sixth, and some in the sixth sphere that fell into the seventh. So the question is still valid. I just want to correct that. So the question basically is this. If you have watched the other video, and you need to have watched the other video to understand this answer. The question is, was there a flaw in the fifth, sixth, and seventh spheres? Because the Ascended Masters allowed these, what I call fallen beings, to descend and take embodiment here. And I've actually touched upon this in other videos, but I think it's valuable enough to give a summary. Now, the thing that I have seen over the years is that some people tend to be very focused on the suffering on earth. And it's very understandable. I'm not trying to blame anybody. I was that way when I was a child and when I was younger and learned about the Holocaust and this and that. I was very focused on the suffering, feeling it was so wrong, it shouldn't happen. And as a result of being focused on the suffering, we tend to develop or accept a certain worldview that something must have gone wrong. And again, it's understandable. When you are grown up on a planet like this Earth here, that you look at all the suffering that's happening, you look at all the inhumane things that people are doing to each other, and you are saying, if there is a loving, almighty, all-knowing God behind this, the classical question, how could God allow evil to exist? And therefore you are thinking something must have gone wrong. And I totally understand it, because for the first many years I was on a spiritual path, even after I'd found the Ascended Master teachings in 1984 in the Summit Lighthouse. I also had this view that something had gone wrong, and I thought that we who are Ascended Master students, we are here to help correct it. And that was a view very much reinforced by the Summit Lighthouse. And in a sense you could say that the Ascended Masters are still reinforcing that view. But you have to, if you really want to solve the enigma of evil, you have to really contemplate free will. And I can't cover all of it in this video, but I have talked about it in several of my videos about the avatar psychology, and how many of us came, and I also explained that in the video about how the world works, how us came to Earth to help hold the balance on Earth, so that the fallen beings who were allowed to embody Earth couldn't destroy the planet. So you really have to come to understand free will. And it took me years to really work on this in myself and ask the Ascended Masters to give me more of an insight into it. But there came a point where I suddenly had this breakthrough or this revelation, and I just experienced nothing has gone wrong with God's basic design. At the overall level of the universe and the entire sphere, nothing has gone wrong. But of course, on Earth, there are many things that you would tend to say they are wrong because it's wrong that people are killing and torturing each other. But you have to separate the two, because what you have to realize that the Earth is such a dense planet, it's an unnatural planet. And you cannot take the conditions on an unnatural planet and project them onto the entire universe or even the entire unascended sphere. Because most of the planets in this unascended sphere are natural planets where there isn't the kind of murder and mayhem that you see on Earth. So what you also have to realize is that when the fourth sphere was created, a sphere is very large. Just look at our universe. Look at how vast it is, how astronomers are continually realizing that the universe is vaster than they thought before. And this means that when our sphere was created, there was still lots of galaxies, lots of solar systems, lots of planets. And there were just a few of these planets where fallen beings were allowed to incarnate. And free will worked itself out in such a way that in the beginning, fallen beings, they incarnated on their own planets. No, in other words, there was a planet where there were only fallen beings. And then, over time, what happened was that there were some of the natural planets that rose to a higher level. They didn't start out as, well, they started out at a certain level, but they ascended to a higher level. An entire planet can ascend to a higher level. And there were certain life streams from some of these planets that didn't want to ascend with the planet. And they then started embodying on some of the planets where there were fallen beings. So gradually over time, it was so that those who weren't willing to grow, they gravitated themselves to planets where there were fallen beings. And then there were other planets that didn't ascend to a higher level. I'm not talking about them going into the ascended realm, but I'm talking about growing to a higher level. So Earth was one of these planets that started in a downward spiral that would have destroyed the planet if it had been allowed to continue. And that's why, as a last-ditch attempt to prevent the planet from being destroyed, the Ascended Masters allowed some fallen beings to embody here, who would then break up this uniform worldview or mindset that people had developed. I explained this again in How the World Was Created. So you have to realize that what you see on Earth, I mean, look at what we know about the universe. Go outside on a dark night, look up into the Milky Way. This is just our galaxy. Millions and billions of solar systems, but there are other galaxies beyond it, billions of galaxies. So, in the entirety of the universe, it's only a tiny sliver where there are fallen beings that are influenced by fallen beings. And it cannot pull the entire universe down. So, again, you can't take conditions on Earth and project that this is how the entire universe works. And I recently in another video talked about how there's actually a certain, what would you call it? Almost like a correspondence in the spheres. So in other words, the first sphere, this was created out of energies that vibrated at a very high level. And therefore, it was pretty easy for the first inhabitants of this sphere to see that the matter in their sphere couldn't exist on its own. I have talked about how there are, in our sphere, there are 4 levels. There's the identity, mental, emotional, and then the physical. But we, of course, with our physical senses, can't see the emotional level, the mental, the identity, or for that matter, the spiritual beyond it. We can't see this with our senses. So that's why many people have come to believe that there's nothing beyond matter, even though everybody has emotions, everybody has thoughts. But they believe that these thoughts reside in the physical brain, are produced by the physical brain. So this is because matter was so dense, but in the first sphere it wasn't so dense, and therefore they could see that it was a result of energy coming from the spiritual realm. It could only exist because of energy coming from the spiritual realm. So the second sphere was denser than the first, the third was denser, the fourth was even denser, and in the fourth sphere, the sphere had become so dense that there were some beings that couldn't see that there was something beyond it. They thought that they could create their own world, define their own world, and that's why they fell. And so the fifth, sixth, and seventh have also become increasingly denser. So in a sense, what the questioner is implying, and I understand this, but what the questioner is implying is that the fact that the spheres are becoming denser and it's becoming more difficult to see that there's something beyond matter, that this is unjust, this is a flaw in the system. But it actually isn't, because this actually gives the beings who embody in the seventh sphere, it gives us experiences that you didn't have in the first sphere, which means that when we ascend, we will actually have a higher level of awareness than the beings from the first sphere, in a certain sense. Now, they have still, of course, had longer time to raise their awareness. But if you look at a being who ascended, newly ascended from the first sphere, and a being who ascends from our sphere, the being who ascends from our sphere will have a higher level of awareness, a higher level of experiences with what the mind can do and what it takes to overcome it. So this is one thing. The density, increasing density, is actually an opportunity for growth. But the other thing is that while it is becoming more difficult to recognize that there's something beyond our sphere, beyond matter, it also, because of the density, it means that when we act out from a state of separation, the consequences are more dramatic, and therefore in one sense it becomes harder to see that there's something beyond matter, but it becomes easier to see the consequences and the futility of going into separation and using the duality consciousness to act out in selfish ways. So one thing becomes harder, another becomes easier, but the net effect of this is to give us a broader experience base than you have in the higher spheres. So is it really unjust? I realize in myself that when I look back at myself 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I can see that I had some separate cells back then that were very focused on this, something had got wrong, and I couldn't understand why God could allow this to happen. But part of it was actually, the ego, the essence of the ego. Because here's the deal. When you go into separation, you are in... Okay, let's step back. I've said we start at the 48th level of consciousness, where we have a sense of connection to something outside our own minds. If we expand on that connection, we connect to the one mind, the Christ mind, and through the Christ mind, we are learning how the world actually works. When we step below the 48th level, we lose that connection to the one mind. Now we are using our own minds, the outer minds, the intellectual, analytical, linear mind, to create a mental image. And we are projecting that image onto the world. So we think that we can define how the world should work. And as I said, because the matter is more dense, we will have more opposition to trying to define our own worldview, which in a sense means we have more of an opportunity to see the futility of it and reconnect to the one mind. But what I really want to say here about this is that when we go into this state of separation, we are projecting out. We are projecting how the world out there should work. We are not taking responsibility for saying, it's up to me to find out how the world really works. And I do this by looking at myself, taking responsibility. In other words, I've said we are co-creators. So we have these identity, mental, emotional minds. We are creating images in those minds that we are projecting onto the matter light. So when you are in a state of connection, you are looking at the physical circumstances you are experiencing, and you are saying, if I don't want more of these physical circumstances, I need to look at my own consciousness and see, why is it that I co-created these circumstances or attracted myself to these circumstances? Because you realize when you take responsibility for yourself that by changing your state of consciousness, you can change your outer circumstances as well. But when you go into separation, you can't recognize this. And therefore, you are projecting an image onto the matter light that will give you suffering. But you're not recognizing that the suffering is the result of the image you're projecting out. So therefore you think you are the victim of other people or nature or even God. So you see the subtle shift that happens here. Once you go into this victim consciousness, that's when you're projecting, oh, I shouldn't be suffering. But you're not willing to admit that your suffering is a result of your state of consciousness, the contents in your emotional, mental, and identity minds. And that you can change those. Regardless of the outer conditions, you can change your state of mind. You're not able to recognize that. And therefore, you have to project out. There has to be a scapegoat. There has to be a reason. And you see in the world, people are projecting. Other people are the reason for my suffering. If I just kill those, if we kill all those other people, we'll solve the problem and there will be no suffering. Or nature is the problem. Or God is the reason why I'm suffering because God is unjust. God gave me free will. And this is where you have to be very, very careful as a spiritual student. And this is something, it took me a long time to grapple with this because there came a point where I actually had to recognize something. And that is that one of the primary goals of the fallen beings, and I talk about this in some of my other videos, is to prove that God was wrong for giving us free will. To prove that free will was a mistake. And they used the suffering on earth to try to prove this. But what has created the suffering on earth? It's the state of consciousness of separation. And the fallen beings have just taken that consciousness to an extreme, which means that the fallen beings have created much of the suffering you see on earth. Not all of it, but much of it. It's certainly the conflicts such as war, created by the fallen beings. And now the fallen beings are using the suffering that they have created to try to make people believe that this is God's fault because there's a flaw in God's design in giving us free will. So in other words, I had to come to a point where I looked at myself and I recognized that I had certain subconscious selves that believed that free will was a mistake. And that those subconscious selves were created because I had come to accept the illusions created by the fallen beings. That was a bit of a shock for me, because up until then I had preferred to believe that I couldn't have accepted some of these false beliefs from the fallen beings. But of course, we all have. And it's understandable. I'm not trying to blame anybody for it. I'm just trying to say, you won't get free of these beliefs until you recognize that you've accepted them. And you wrestle with this question of, was it really a mistake with free will? And to me, honestly, I mean, it was the outer teachings of the Ascended Masters that helped me to get thinking about it, but it was really asking the Masters within to give me the insights that could help me free myself from this illusion. Because I started to see it was an illusion, but I couldn't quite see what the problem was. And I came to a point where I had probably several smaller revelations, but I came to a point where I realized that free will is the only way you can grow in consciousness. And the whole purpose of life is the growth in consciousness. And my greatest love is the growth in consciousness. I want to transcend myself. I want to grow. I want to rise to a higher level of consciousness. I want to ascend. And if I didn't have free will, I couldn't. Because I'd just be defined by something outside myself. I'd be an automaton. I would be like an AI computer that is defined by its programming. And the only way God could give me the opportunity to consciously, deliberately expand my sense of self was to give me free will, complete free will, and of course everybody else. And I also realized that the purpose of an undescended sphere is that we work out this dilemma of free will, this challenge of free will, so we voluntarily and consciously give up using our free will from the state of separation. I mean, the whole purpose of an unascended sphere, where nothing is permanent, is to give us the opportunity to work out this challenge of free will until we say, okay, I've experimented enough with using free will through the illusion of separation. I'm going to voluntarily and consciously give up that. So I only use my free will from the perspective of the one mind, the Christ mind, where I do what is good for the whole that I am part of, because I see myself as part of the whole. And therefore I see that raising myself is raising the whole is raising myself. And you do this voluntarily, and then you can ascend. You become a permanent being. And until you do that, you can still be confused by this enigma of free will. I understand. I'm trying to blame anybody for it. I'm just saying that you can resolve it. It took me a while. It took me quite a while. And I really had to study the teachings that the Ascended Masters had given, and I really had to ask for their help. But it did eventually. I came to that point where I just saw that it wasn't a flaw. It's the very foundation for our growth. And the purpose of our existence is to exercise our free will. Now understand, as the questioner is saying, that he thinks that the fallen beings should just have been snuffed out when they refused to ascend with the fourth sphere. But that then wouldn't allow free will to work itself out. So, in other words, there are checks and balances. I mean, in the end, you could say that it is a given, as I just said in a recent video, that our sphere will ascend. But there is a lot of leeway in the individual beings, because, as I also said in a recent video, it's like some beings will have to do whatever can be done with free will. In order to explore the depth of separation you can go into given the density of our sphere. And I mean, one of the things that helped me, and maybe this is what confuses some people, at least it confused me for a time, because it's sort of a challenge of the Christ mind, because you start connecting to the one mind, and you start sensing the oneness of all life. And this puts you into an almost schizophrenic state, because on a planet like Earth, sensing the oneness of all life and then looking at the murder and mayhem that's taking place on Earth is really tough. It's really a tough challenge. Somebody who's deliberately killing other people or torturing them, can you really say that me having a certain level of Christ consciousness means I should feel oneness with that person? And so what in contemplating this over a period of time, I came to realize that on a planet like Earth, it's perfectly in order that you recognize, and you recognize this with Christ's discernment, that the purpose of this planet is not to be an ideal planet. It's not to be like a natural planet. Eventually, of course, it's the goal of the masters that the Earth will become a natural planet. But the purpose right now, it's like a halfway house. It's like a purgatory. It's like an in-between state, where people who are in separation can work out their free will. And that means that when you start attaining Christhood, you can't focus on these people that are still in separation and think that you are flawed if you don't feel oneness with them. Because even though in a certain sense the Christ mind is behind everything, it's obviously not in these people's minds. They are in the state of consciousness of Antichrist. And therefore you, as a spiritual being, you don't need to develop oneness with these beings. You simply need to recognize these people have chosen to go into the state of separation. There's nothing I could say that would change their minds. That's what I realized. I had some very tough experiences, even with spiritual people, that had been on the spiritual path for years and suddenly flipped, and now they were very antagonistic, very aggressive towards me personally. And I had to simply recognize they've gone into a state of consciousness where I can't reach them. I can't help these people. But that also means that I don't need to focus my attention on them. I don't need to feel that there's something wrong with me because I can't help them. And I don't need to have some kind of loyalty towards them or sympathy towards them. Because on a planet like Earth, I, who are choosing the path of oneness, the spiritual path, I don't have to feel empathy or sympathy or loyalty towards those who have chosen to go into separation. Because I have a right to raise my consciousness and to ascend from Earth, regardless of what other people choose. Doesn't matter what they choose. I have an individual right to pursue my personal growth and my ascension. And by doing this, I actually pull up on the whole, of course, making it easier for people to see through the dualistic illusions. But anyway, that's not even the point. I came to a point where I realized that I have to allow other people to have their complete free will, but I also have to allow myself to have my free will. So what I'm trying to say in relation to this question is that I understand that the person who's asking the question has this very strong sense that something has gone wrong, that this was unfair, that the Ascended Master shouldn't have allowed it, that there's an original flaw or wrench in the works. But that comes from these separate selves. And it could be that some of these separate selves have this, as I said, a certain sense that you should feel oneness with others, you should be loyal, you should try to help others. And so you feel like you are in a catch-22, because you feel, this is at least what I came to realize, that I very much felt that I should be able to help other people, but I saw that there were people I couldn't help, so I felt that there must be something I haven't done right. There must be some argument I can come up with. I must be able to change myself so I can help these people. I should be able to help everybody. And that was not grasping free will. Because the reality is that there comes a point where you have to say, okay, I accept free will. And therefore I accept that these people have a right to make the choices they are making. But regardless of the choices they are making, I have a right to make my own choices. And I'm choosing to leave these people behind. And when you do that, you're no longer feeling you're in a catch-22. What I'm trying to say is that I sense, I can't speak for the person, but I felt the same dilemma. And when I felt that dilemma, my frustration came from this fact that I felt I was stuck because I had to do something to help these people and I didn't know what, because I could see that there was nothing I could say or do. But when I got myself unstuck by accepting free will, that my own free will, I could just let it go and say, okay, And I realized in myself, Kim Michaels, you have a subconscious self that thinks you know better than God. Because it thinks that you can fix what God can't fix or what the Ascended Masters can't fix. And I separated myself from that self, and I realized, oh my goodness, this sphere that we are in is very, very old. There's been previous spheres before it. Everything has worked out. God's law actually works. God's principles actually work. There is no flaw there that I need to correct. And when I realized I don't need to correct anything, I could say, okay, then I can let go of the idea that there's a flaw. Because it's the idea that there's a flaw and that I have to correct it that makes me feel stuck. That's what puts me in a catch-22. And when I let go of the whole ball of wax, it was like such a relief, such a peace. And I think it's the only way to really ascend from Earth, is to go through that transformation where you realize that you're done with Earth because there's nothing you have to correct here. You're free to go. And again, not everybody is in their last embodiment. You may have to, maybe your divine plan to come back into embodiment and help manifest the golden age. And you may still need to have that sense that there's a purpose for you doing this, and that is to correct things and make Earth a natural planet. So I'm saying there can be two different ways to approach this. You may not be ready to let go of this that I'm saying. I wasn't ready, wouldn't have been ready 5 years ago, for example. But ultimately, we have to come to that point where we really see the incredible wisdom of free will, but also that free will means that it has to be allowed to work itself out until beings see the absurdity of what they're doing from separation. And on the planet Earth, of course, that absurdity is very, very absurd. But that's why, as I said, we can decide individually. I'm not going to focus my attention on this. I'm not going to feeling that I'm responsible for helping these people. And we can also decide individually, I've had enough of this planet. I'm out of here. And so, I hope this helps some people. It certainly helped me a lot to contemplate these very, very subtle, very difficult issues of free will.